Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Spin It Reviews, and today I'm going to be reviewing Awolnation and 4 Years Strong and talking about my experience at X-Fest in the debut episode of Thumbnail Jumble. So I've had this idea for a series for a while now, initially just as a way of getting out my brief thoughts on albums that I don't have that many thoughts on, but given that, like I mentioned earlier, I am going to be really busy this month, I figured that now would be a good time to debut this series, since I'm not going to have time to put out full reviews of every album I want to get my thoughts on. And after this month, I'm basically going to be using this as an opportunity to talk about albums that may have come out a few months ago that I might not get that many views for doing a review of. Maybe something that another channel captured all my thoughts on that I'm going to reference in my brief thoughts on segment in this video, or just little maybe bits of music news or little concert reviews, just scattered throughout it. It's usually going to come in 3 sections. These videos probably going to come in around 10 minutes, hopefully. The first album I'm going to be talking about today is the new one from Awolnation called Run. Now, even if that name doesn't exactly ring a bell to you, you might know their big hit from a couple years ago called Sail. You know, the one with the guy screaming over some indie synths about his ADD. Yeah, that one. Well, definitely one of their more abrasive songs, thanks to the screened vocals used throughout, and saying it's a strange one to be their big crossover smash is definitely an understatement, especially given their popular songs like, say, Not Your Fault. It definitely still did a good job of introducing Awolnation's unique brand of off-kilter, but still catchy electronic synth pop to the world. And now, 4 years after their debut Monolithic Symphony came out, we have their sophomore album called Run. Now, I have been referring to Awolnation as they over the past minute or so, but this is really essentially a solo project of singer, songwriter, producer, and multi-instrumentalist Aaron Bruno. In fact, he's actually said in some interviews that he recorded this entire album by himself and barely let another person hear it until it was done, and listening to certain parts of this, you can definitely tell. Sure, there are hooks aplenty throughout this record, some ridiculously fun blasts of energy, and some just plain great pop jams like the single Hollow Moon, Bad Wolf, but there's also a good amount of variety of this album that helps make it as engaging as it is. He pulls off sentimental balladry, huge arena-sized choruses, buzzing electronic drops, and even some acoustic folk stuff in the case of one song. Lyrically, you can really hear the isolation that went into the making of this album, to me essentially being an examination of Aaron's mental state, which if you've heard Sail, you could pretty safely say isn't exactly all that stable. The last line of the opening title track really says it all, when he says, "You people are mistaken if you think that I'm awake and celebrating anything that I've become." My personal favorite, Jailbreak, from what I'm gathering, is basically about trying to take time to fix yourself and trying to start over mentally, but at the same time trying to not lose connection with the people that you care about in the process, and how hard it can be to maintain that kind of balance when you're going through a transitional state. I'm not really going to go into every song here, but the rest of the album does tackle generally similar themes in a very well-written way a good majority of the time. But here's the big catch. A few nitpicks aside, if Run was just the first 10 tracks here, ending with Holy Roller and clocking in at about 37 minutes, I would be ready to call this easily one of my favorite albums of 2015 so far. However, there are then 4 more tracks after that, and the sheer drop-off in quality that happens after those first 10 tracks is simply astonishing. I feel like tracks 11 to 14 on this thing are just a hodgepodge of every bad idea that popped into Aaron's head as he was making the actual good parts of this album that he just kind of duct taped together at the last minute and slapped onto the back to, I guess, pad out time or something. We get bad Passion Pit and even Sublime impressions from what I'm hearing. Terribly produced hard rock riffs that do not fit with the songs that they're a part of. Some of his least appropriate screaming ever. Some of his least coherent lyrics, especially compared with some of the better moments on this album. And just other stuff that just should have been left on the cutting room floor, unquestionably. Because of this, even though I really want to highly recommend Awolnation's run, and there is a great album living within this, I simply can't do that. So I'm going to give it a 7 and give it just a very conditioned recommendation. But something I can more wholeheartedly recommend is the new self-titled album by 4 Years Strong. Now, I got into this band after loving their performance at Warped Tour last year, as you'd see in my recap video from last June. And since then, I've been really looking forward to their next album. Now, their sound is one that people classify as quote-unquote easycore, which I kind of consider one of those cringe-worthy, trendy genre names. And I also feel weird about calling them that, since a band like, say, Chunk No Captain Chunk also gets that kind of label, and I don't really think that either of those bands sound alike at all. Basically, think of a combination of modern-day pop-punk attitude and melodies, killer hard rock riffs, and even some tinges of hardcore here and there. This is the first album I've heard in full from these guys, but from what I've gathered from listening to some stuff from each of their previous albums, this seems to combine all of the best traits of their past work into something a lot more realized. Now, I know this is something that might piss off the pop-punk kids in terms of comparisons, but this really reminds me of what Kings of Leon did with their album Mechanical Bull a couple years ago. You got the heaviness and angst from their earlier records from the mid to late 2000s, but then they also incorporate some of the great hooks and choruses from their polarizing previous one that actually helps most of these songs stick in the brain pretty easily. Case in point, songs like Eating My Words and Go Down in History. One thing I really gotta give 4 Years Strong credit for is the layers of interplay going on between the band's two co-lead singers and guitarists. The way they trade off lines in their rough voices on a lot of these tracks really adds to the energy, and the seamless fusions of rhythm and lead guitar parts can make for some of the best moments on here. Personally, I'm always a sucker for a great harmonized guitar solo, and there are multiple fantastic examples of that throughout this record. Now, I'd be lying if I said that a couple tracks didn't just go in one ear and out the other, and the little hardcore punk detour in the middle of this, Who Cares, doesn't really have all that much replay value to me. Plus, I would have liked to see Tread Lightly from their previous EP, Go Down in History, make it onto this thing like the title track from that thing did. But aside from that, this is a great, heavy, and catchy record from a band that's done the very rare task of actually standing out in the world of modern pop-punk, and it gets an easy 8 from me. Now, if you want to hear a more in-depth analysis of this that essentially echoes my thoughts, then I'd recommend checking out the ARTV review of this, which I'll link in the description. And finally, I'm going to be giving my brief thoughts on my experience at X-Fest 2015. Now, I did do a more full concert review of X-Fest 2014 last year, if you go back in the channel archives about that. Essentially, this is a festival held by a local radio station called 91X, where they get a bunch of acts they play on the station, some new, some old, and just have this big annual festival. It's usually a lot of fun. This was no exception. But the thing is that this is probably my least favorite X-Fest of the 4 of them that I've been to so far. Now, there were some great acts going into this. There was Modest Mouse was awesome. Pennywise did their thing, you know. I haven't really heard much from them, but they definitely did a good job. Death and Rub 1979 was great. Robert DeLong, I actually got to meet him and his performances are always incredible just because of that great like setup he has. He definitely is like the archetype for how much musicianship can go into an electronic music producer's performance. But the thing that kinda killed this for me was just the fact of how unfocused it was. Now, it did sort of have a thing going with sort of an underground theme, like the first, like the side stage, the little smaller area, had Robert DeLong, Death from Above, Meg Myers, the AWOL, who I think is a little overrated, but just my opinion. A local band called Shady Francos, this awesome band called Moon Hooch, who was just like two horn players and a drummer was playing between sets as like a house band, which I thought was a fantastic idea. Really great development on their part, something I hope they do more in the future. But the thing is that once you go above there, like Cold War Kids did their thing, Palm Vials did their thing. I'm not that familiar with either of them, but you know, they did a good job. But then we get into stuff like Yellow Wolf and Public Enemy and The Cult, who are not that bad, who are not bad on their own. They all, again, they did their thing. Yellow Wolf, I'm a little hit or miss on. Like, I love Till It's Gone, but then he did some terrible rap rock that's like Limp Bizkit-ian in its cringeworthiness. But the thing is, let me just tell you, these top 4 acts that headline this thing: Yellow Wolf, Public Enemy, The Cult, and Modest Mouse. Who likes all 4 of these acts? Like, even someone like me, who has pretty diverse tastes, I was still bored out of my mind some of this, especially The Cult, who I personally consider one of the more distinctly boring rock bands of the 80s, really. Like, they just have no identity, in my opinion, and you don't really realize that until, like, you watch them for 45 minutes, but I digress. The thing is that I don't really think that this festival really knew who they wanted to appeal to. Like, it just seemed like there wasn't one artist that, like, everyone in the audience could agree on by the time that the set was closing, by the time the festival was closing down. And that is not really a good sign. The ticket sales were kind of low this year, to the point where where everyone with, like me, that had a lawn ticket had to exchange it for a seat ticket, which I thought was really cool, but isn't exactly a good sign, you know? I think it just kind of like drove some people away. And it's not even like Warped Tour, where you got something for everyone, but there's multiple stages, so you don't have to watch everyone if you don't want to. In this case, like, I can't imagine someone that was like into every artist on here, so it was just very inconsistent in terms of enjoyment. And I mean, I did get to meet Robert DeLong, which was awesome, and there were some great performances in here again, but I feel like the lack of focus did kind of lower the impact of X-Fest this year, in my opinion. Whew, so that unscripted rambling aside, that concludes this first episode of Thumbnail Jumble. As you can probably tell, this isn't really so much like fully like formed or articulated reviews, more just like brief thoughts on things, on like certain albums or concerts, just whatever. I might throw in like a music news thing here and there. Who knows, really, it's just kind of a variety thing, just so I don't have to put as much time into video making as I would in months when I'm less busy. What are your thoughts on the Awolnation album, the 4 Year Strong album? If you went to X-Fest, what do you think of that? Do you kind of agree with what I had to say in this case? Let me know in the comments down below. What do you think of like this kind of format? Would you prefer if I just like did a bunch of quick videos and just uploaded those all at once, or just did this kind of long bang 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 kind of format? Let me know your thoughts on that, and like the Facebook page in the description for updates, and hopefully I'll see you in the next episode of Spin It Reviews.